Have you ever wondered if a single person could be everywhere and nowhere all at once? Imagine a thief so elusive that for over a decade, the city of Osaka was gripped by a wave of flawless robberies, each one executed with military precision. Yet no two witnesses could agree on what he looked like. Some swore they saw a young man with sharp features. Others described an older gentleman with a heavy beard. 11 suspects, 11 faces, 11 different identities. And yet, behind every heist, there was a chilling certainty that all these crimes bore the same silent signature. What you're about to discover might surprise you. For this was not a gang, not a network of criminals, but a single ghost slipping through the cracks of reality. This ghost was a master of disguise, a chameleon who never repeated the same face twice. The authorities believed they were hunting an entire syndicate, a well-organized group working under the cover of darkness. But no, it was just one man, a figure so skilled that traditional methods of identification, cameras, eyewitnesses, police sketches were rendered useless. Every time he struck, it was as if the city was facing a new adversary, someone completely different. Yet, his moves were too precise, his timing too perfect to be random. The pattern emerged not through his appearance, but through the meticulous planning and the uncanny execution of each robbery. To the people of Osaka, he was a phantom, a legend born from whispers and fear. To the police, he was the impossible case, a puzzle with no edges to grasp. And to the shadowy underworld of the Yakuza, he was a valuable asset, a tool wielded by forces he could never fully control. This man didn't just steal valuables. He stole identities, crafting hyper-realistic disguises and weaving entire digital lives for personas that existed only in the shadows. He inhabited each new face long enough to become indistinguishable, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and discarded masks. Stay with me until the end as we peel back the layers of this extraordinary story, revealing how a single man rewrote the rules of crime in Osaka. What made this thief so untouchable? How did he evade capture for so long? The answers lie not in the faces he wore, but in the subtle habits he couldn't hide. And when the investigators finally discovered the truth, it was a revelation that shook the city's very foundations. But the tale doesn't end here. There is much more to uncover about the man behind the masks, the ghost who turned an entire city into his playground without ever showing his true face. The next chapter awaits, and what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about identity, deception, and the art of the perfect crime. It's fascinating how a single story can ripple through the lives of so many, isn't it? When we peel back the layers of this man's carefully constructed facade, we don't just see a criminal mastermind. We glimpse the fragile humanity hiding beneath the masks. And that's where things get truly compelling. Because as much as this tale is about deception and mystery, it's equally about the choices we make when confronted with our own shadows. If any part of this resonates with you, whether it's the thrill of the chase, the complexity of identity, or the quiet struggle behind every decision, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moved you most in this story so far? Maybe a detail that caught you off guard? Or a feeling that lingered long after the last scene? Sharing your perspective not only enriches this conversation, but also builds a community where every voice matters. And if you find yourself drawn into this journey, wanting to see how the layers unfold, a simple like goes a long way. It's a small gesture that helps this story reach more people who might be just as eager to dive deeper. Likewise, subscribing means you won't miss a single twist, a single revelation that could change everything you thought you knew. It's more than just following a channel. It's about being part of something bigger, a shared exploration of truths that challenge and inspire. Your engagement here is what breathes life into these stories, turning them from mere words on a screen into an experience that connects us all. So, if this story speaks to you, take a moment to comment, like, and subscribe. Not because it's expected, but because it fuels this journey and keeps the conversation alive. After all, the next chapter is just around the corner, and it promises to unravel even deeper mysteries that you won't want to miss. The early incidents were so precise they almost seemed choreographed. Each heist unfolded in near silence, without the usual commotion that typically accompanies such crimes. No alarms blared, no guards raised an alarm, and no witnesses recalled more than fleeting shadows slipping through corridors. The perpetrators struck with a confidence that suggested meticulous preparation, leaving behind no fingerprints, no surveillance footage of substance, and no discernible pattern in their movements. What confounded investigators most was the ever-shifting appearance of the suspects. One day, a tall, broad-shouldered man of unmistakable Japanese descent would be caught on a grainy security camera, slipping out of a luxury boutique with a stolen artifact tucked beneath a trench coat. Days later, a short, wiry figure, distinctly foreign in appearance, would execute an almost identical theft at a separate location. Careless assumptions were impossible. The differences were too striking to ignore. The police found themselves chasing shadows, unable to determine whether these were the acts of a single, highly skilled group adept at disguises or multiple unrelated gangs operating with coincidental similarities. The suspects' physical features varied wildly. Some had shaved heads, while others sported thick, unkempt hair. Some moved with the calm assurance of seasoned criminals, others with a nervous energy that suggested less experience. The only consistent element was the flawless execution of each crime. No forced entries, no dropped items, no hurried escapes. Evidence was minimal, almost to the point of impossibility. This level of precision suggested more than just luck or skill. It hinted at an intricate understanding of the urban landscape, access to inside information, or perhaps even a technological edge. Osaka's sprawling metropolis, with its maze-like alleyways and towering buildings, provided the perfect backdrop for such elusive activities. The city's layered infrastructure, combining modern steel and glass with older, narrow streets, offered countless escape routes and blind spots. In some cases, the suspects appeared to vanish into thin air, leaving investigators to wonder if they had access to hidden passages or underground networks unknown even to the local authorities. These possibilities pushed the boundaries of conventional police work, forcing reliance on new tactics and cross-disciplinary analysis. Forensic teams began to analyze patterns not just of crime scenes but of urban foot traffic, surveillance blind spots, and even the subtle fluctuations in city lighting at different hours. Despite the growing complexity, the police remained convinced that they were confronting multiple independent groups rather than a single entity. Each new suspect profile seemed to confirm this theory. Different ethnicities, body types, and apparent skill sets suggested diverse origins and motivations. Yet, the uncanny similarity in modus operandi, the same swift, silent approach and the absence of errors, introduced a paradox. How could such disparate individuals or groups converge on the same method with such consistency? It was an enigma that gnawed at the investigative teams, prompting debates late into the night. Some officers speculated about a shared mentor or a central coordinator operating behind the scenes, while others leaned toward the idea of a competitive underworld where different factions learned from each other's successes and failures, adapting their techniques in real time. The psychological toll on the investigators was palpable. The uncertainty bred frustration and unease, as every lead seemed to dissolve before yielding concrete results. Analysts pored over every fragment of data, trying to extract meaning from noise. The city itself felt altered, as if the invisible presence of these criminals had shifted the rhythm of daily life. Businesses invested in additional security measures. Residents grew wary of venturing out after dark, and the police force scrambled to maintain a semblance of control amid the escalating tension. Still, the criminals remained one step ahead, their identities obscured behind masks of normalcy and deception. In the midst of this chaos, a few subtle clues began to emerge. Tiny inconsistencies in timing, slight deviations in escape routes, and rare overlapping sightings that hinted at coordination rather than randomness. These threads, however faint, suggested that the truth might be more complex than initially believed. The investigation was not merely about identifying suspects, but about unraveling a web of connections woven through the city's underbelly. It became clear that understanding the psychological profiles of these criminals, their motivations, fears, and interactions, would be as crucial as any physical evidence. The line between hunter and hunted blurred within the labyrinthine streets, and every shadow seemed to hide a story waiting to be uncovered. The masks were more than mere disguises. They were meticulously crafted facades designed to erase the very essence of identity. The artisan behind them operated in near-total secrecy, a shadow figure rumored to be an expert in prosthetics and materials science, blending traditional craftsmanship with cutting-edge technology. His workshop, concealed beneath a nondescript warehouse in one of the city's forgotten industrial districts, was a place where synthetic skin and human likeness merged seamlessly. Each mask was a masterpiece of illusion, down to the faintest detail. A network of tiny pores mimicked real skin. Subtle variations in color and texture made the surfaces almost indistinguishable from living flesh. What set these masks apart was not only their physical quality but the integration of dynamic elements. Embedded within the synthetic layers were microactuators and flexible polymers that allowed limited muscle movement, enabling the wearer to simulate natural microexpressions. The barely perceptible twitch of an eyebrow, the tightening of lips, or the slight furrowing of the brow. This technology, rare and highly guarded, meant that even under close scrutiny, the masks could deceive those trained to read human emotion. The line between mask and face blurred, confusing witnesses and surveillance systems alike. Each mask came paired with a fully developed identity dossier. These were not simple fake IDs but comprehensive social histories painstakingly constructed to withstand digital verification. Birth certificates, driver's licenses, credit histories, social media profiles, and even medical records were fabricated or stolen and modified to fit the new persona. This allowed the user to operate with a credible backstory, gaining access to restricted areas, passing through checkpoints, or even renting apartments without raising suspicion. The digital profiles were particularly sophisticated, complete with interactions and networks that mimic genuine online behavior. The connection to the Yakuza was no coincidence. The syndicate's influence stretched beyond conventional crime, investing heavily in technological innovation to maintain their dominance. The masks were part of a larger strategy, an invisible weapon in psychological warfare and urban espionage. Their use was not limited to simple evasion. They enabled infiltration into rival organizations, manipulation of law enforcement, and the orchestration of complex schemes where identity itself became a battleground. For investigators, this presented a new kind of challenge. Traditional forensic methods were rendered almost useless against someone who could shift faces like a chameleon. Witness testimonies became unreliable, as victims and bystanders could no longer trust their own perceptions. Surveillance footage, often grainy and inconclusive to begin with, failed to reveal consistent features. Psychological profiling took on an added layer of complexity, as the suspect's outward appearance was a carefully curated mask, hiding the real personality beneath. The city's undercurrent of tension thickened with each discovery. The masks were a symbol of the broader fragmentation of truth, where reality twisted to fit the needs of those who controlled it. The line between genuine and counterfeit identity collapsed, feeding into a collective unease. It wasn't just about catching a criminal anymore. It was about navigating a maze of deception that challenged the very notion of self. Inside the investigation room, agents pored over the fragments of information gathered from informants and recovered documents. Every detail about the masks, from materials used to the timeline of their production, was cross-referenced against known criminal activities. Patterns emerged: certain locations, times, and events aligned with the deployment of these hyper-realistic disguises. The tactical advantage they provided was evident in the precision of the crimes committed, often executed with an unnerving calm and efficiency. Psychologists on the team noted the psychological strain this imposed not only on the victims but on the operatives themselves. The threat of an adversary who could assume countless faces blurred the lines of trust within their own ranks. Paranoia seeped into interactions, as anyone could potentially be an imposter wearing a mask. The cityscape itself seemed to pulse with hidden threats, ordinary faces concealing extraordinary secrets. Meanwhile, deeper analysis of the digital footprints left by the fabricated identities revealed a pattern of controlled chaos, a network of false leads and dead ends designed to misdirect and exhaust investigative resources. Each identity was a node in a sprawling web, linking to others in a complex lattice intended to shield the true operator. It was a system built not just for concealment but for active manipulation, turning the pursuit into a psychological game where every step forward risked stepping into a trap. The investigation now hinged on uncovering the artisan's identity and location, a task complicated by the fact that this figure was insulated from direct contact with the operatives using the masks. Communication was handled through encrypted channels and intermediaries, creating layers of obfuscation. Tracking the supply chain of materials used in mask production became a critical lead, but even that trail was riddled with false starts and misleading data. As the agents delved further, the city itself seemed to watch back. The flickering neon lights, the endless maze of alleyways, and the silent surveillance cameras formed a backdrop to a narrative that was only just beginning to unravel. Each mask was a fragment of a larger puzzle, and each fragment held a secret waiting to be exposed. The boundaries between reality and illusion, hunter and hunted, began to dissolve, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of perception and truth. Before he ever stepped into the shadows of his criminal acts, the man had already inhabited the life of his new persona with painstaking care. It wasn't enough to simply change his appearance or alter his voice. He had to become that person entirely, from the way they moved through the city to the habits they cultivated. For weeks, sometimes even a month, he would live as someone else, and the city unwittingly accepted the new identity as fact. He took the bus every morning, sitting in the same seat, nodding at the same strangers, allowing the rhythm of the daily commute to root him deeper into the routine. His eyes scanned the worn upholstery and flickered over advertisements peeling from the windows, but he did not see them as an intruder. Instead, he belonged. The bus driver, a middle-aged man with a habit of humming old tunes, would greet him by name, and the man would smile back with a rehearsed warmth, the kind of familiarity that dissolves suspicion. On foot, he frequented the corner stores, the quiet coffee shops where the baristas remembered regulars by the way they ordered and the slight crease in their brows. He purchased groceries, not just the bare minimum but enough to suggest a real life, fresh vegetables, bread, sometimes a bottle of wine. The cashiers would exchange brief remarks about the weather or the latest neighborhood news, and he would respond appropriately, never too eager, never too detached. This was a performance that stretched beyond the surface. It was a meticulous orchestration of small signals that confirmed his existence to those around him. His interactions with neighbors were equally calculated. He learned their names, their routines, their concerns. Sometimes he joined casual conversations on stoops or in doorways, nodding thoughtfully, asking questions that revealed a grasp of local happenings without overstepping. He knew when the old man down the hall complained about the streetlights flickering, or when the young couple moved in next door, carrying boxes in the late afternoon sun. These details were not trivial. They formed the scaffold of his fabricated life, a framework solid enough to withstand scrutiny. When law enforcement began to investigate a crime linked to one of his assumed identities, every detail they uncovered only reinforced the illusion. Surveillance cameras showed him buying a newspaper or stopping at a deli. Witnesses described the man they saw as ordinary, unremarkable, blending seamlessly into the urban tapestry. Police reports included statements from shopkeepers and neighbors who vouched for his presence days before the crime, creating a timeline that seemed airtight. It was a masterstroke of deception. The person they sought was not a phantom but a figure deeply embedded in the fabric of everyday life. This process required patience and discipline, qualities that set him apart from typical criminals driven by impulse or desperation. His work resembled that of an investigator building a case rather than a thief planning a heist. Every detail mattered: the way his shoes scuffed on the sidewalk, the consistency of his grocery list, the cadence of his greetings. The city itself became a stage, and he its method actor, slipping into a role with such precision that even the most attentive observer would be fooled. Yet beneath this careful construction lay a darker calculus. Each identity was a mask not only to deceive others but to obscure fragments of himself. The psychological toll of living multiple lives was invisible to those around him, but it shaped his every move. The constant shifting blurred the lines of his own reality, making it harder to distinguish where one persona ended and another began. This fragmentation was both weapon and shield, allowing him to evade capture while surrendering parts of his own coherence. As the city hummed around him, unaware of the game unfolding in its midst, the man continued to weave his web. The ritual of becoming someone else, step by step, day by day, was essential before the final act, the crime itself, could take place. In this dance of shadows and light, fact and fiction, the boundaries bent, and the truth became a malleable thing, shaped by the stories he told and the lives he briefly inhabited. The trap set for those who hunted him was not just the crime scene but the entire life he had constructed in its wake. Detective Harris sat back in his chair, the dim light of the precinct casting long shadows across the scattered case files. Months of poring over the details had finally begun to coalesce into an unsettling pattern, one that no one else seemed to notice. Each crime, initially dismissed as the work of unrelated individuals driven by different motives, bore the same signature precision. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. The cameras were always disabled at exactly 2:17 a.m., a seemingly random moment that, upon closer inspection, revealed a meticulous timing down to the second. The escape routes chosen defied logic. Alleys too narrow for easy transit, rooftops seemingly inaccessible without specialized equipment, even sewers mapped out with an intimate familiarity that suggested prior reconnaissance. What unsettled Harris most wasn't just the methodical nature of the crimes, but the fact that the suspects apprehended had no apparent connection. Different ages, backgrounds, and even physical abilities. Yet, the crimes themselves whispered of a singular mind orchestrating each act with unnerving consistency. It was as if a single puppeteer pulled the strings, manipulating multiple actors in a grand performance designed to confuse and mislead. Harris's gaze drifted to the photographs pinned on the corkboard. The faces blurred, but the angles remained consistent, the same vantage points captured in the few remaining active surveillance feeds before the cameras fell silent. It was a choreography of shadows, every movement rehearsed and executed with cold calculation. The precision was almost surgical, as if the perpetrator possessed an intimate knowledge of urban geography and human behavior, exploiting blind spots and predictable patrol patterns with clinical efficiency. The detective's mind turned to the psychological profile emerging beneath the surface. Whoever was behind this was not merely a criminal. They were a strategist. The detachment required to inhabit multiple identities, to live fragmented lives that converged only in the execution of these crimes, suggested a fractured psyche or an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization. The ritualistic aspect, the gradual transformation into a new persona before each act, hinted at a deeper compulsion, a need to dissolve the self repeatedly in order to evade capture and perhaps to satisfy some internal narrative. Harris remembered the reports from officers who had witnessed the aftermath. Empty rooms stripped of any trace, security systems disabled without a trace of forced entry, and witnesses who described fleeting glimpses of figures moving with unnatural fluidity. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, caught in a silent game of cat and mouse. Each crime scene was a puzzle box, an enigma wrapped in the mundane details of urban life. Yet beneath those details lay the unmistakable imprint of one mind weaving a web of deception. The detective's instincts sharpened as he revisited the timeline. The intervals between the crimes were deliberate, neither too close to draw immediate suspicion nor so far apart as to lose momentum. Each incident acted as both a statement and a challenge, taunting law enforcement with an invisible hand guiding the chaos. Harris considered the possibility that the multiple suspects were pawns, expendable and interchangeable, each chosen to misdirect and fragment the investigation. This realization shifted the entire approach to the case. Instead of chasing disparate leads, the focus turned inward, seeking the invisible thread that bound the crimes together. A search for the ghost behind the mask, the architect of the pattern hidden beneath layers of misdirection. The city's network of streets, alleys, and forgotten passages became a map not just of geography but of psychology, a labyrinth reflecting the mind of the perpetrator. As Harris leaned forward, tracing the lines connecting the points on the map, a new image began to emerge. A solitary figure moving through the urban landscape with purpose, slipping through cracks in the system, exploiting moments of vulnerability with a surgeon's precision. The pattern, once invisible, now pulsed with a quiet inevitability. It was no longer a question of if the next act would occur, but where and how. The detective knew that uncovering this hidden logic was only the beginning. The true challenge lay in anticipating the next move, in peering beyond the visible and into the shifting shadows where the perpetrator thrived. The city's pulse quickened, and with it, the tension that hung in the air. A tension born not just of crime, but of the intricate dance between hunter and hunted, reality and illusion, the seen and the unseen. The artisan's workshop was tucked away in a narrow alley, far from the neon glare of the city's main streets. Its facade was unremarkable. A weathered wooden door with faded kanji etched into the frame, hardly the kind of place one would expect to find connections to a shadowy syndicate like the Yakuza. Yet, inside, the air was thick with the scent of lacquer and resin, the faint hum of meticulous craftsmanship echoing against the walls. It was here that the hyper-realistic masks were born, each one a silent masterpiece designed to erase identity and sow confusion. But the artisan himself was a ghost in the underworld's machinery. When questioned, members of the Yakuza claimed they had no knowledge of the man behind the masks beyond his role as a supplier. He wasn't bound by the usual codes, not a soldier or lieutenant, not even a distant cousin attached by blood or business. He operated on the margins, tolerated because of the profit his creations generated, but never fully integrated into the clan's hierarchy. This detachment made him an enigma, a wild card in a game otherwise defined by strict loyalty and brutal enforcement. The detective's investigation began to sketch a portrait of a figure who thrived in isolation, a craftsman whose talents were exploited but whose allegiances were ambiguous at best. Unlike the typical operatives who wore their clan affiliations like armor, this man shrouded himself in anonymity, his presence known only through the eerie realism of the masks he fashioned. Each mask was a perfect mimicry of a face, wrinkles, pores, even the subtle glint in the eyes, tools not just for disguise but for psychological dislocation. Victims and witnesses alike were left questioning what they had seen, their memories clouded by the uncanny semblance of the imposters. The artisan's detachment mirrored the robber's own existence. The thief, a figure who moved through the city's labyrinthine streets with the precision of a specter, similarly operated outside the usual power structures. There were no known ties to any syndicate, no claims of ownership by clans that ruled the city's underbelly. This rogue's freedom from allegiance made him both unpredictable and dangerous, a variable that the Yakuza tolerated because it meant profit but could never fully control. As the layers of the investigation peeled back, it became clear that the masks were more than mere tools. They were instruments of psychological warfare, designed to fracture reality itself. The robber's use of these masks introduced a level of disorientation that went beyond physical concealment. In the chaos of his heists, witnesses struggled to reconcile the familiar with the grotesque imitation, and law enforcement found its efforts undermined by the sheer ambiguity of identity. The detective pondered the implications. Here was a criminal who weaponized perception, who turned the city's own complexity into a shield. The masks made it impossible to track patterns based on appearance, forcing investigators to rely on subtler clues, behavioral idiosyncrasies, timing, and the faintest traces left behind in the wake of the robber's passage. The artisan's craftsmanship was a silent partner in this psychological labyrinth, his creations amplifying the thief's ability to vanish into the urban wilderness. Yet, despite the artisan's shadowy role, the detective sensed a deeper fracture within the criminal ecosystem. The robber's independence hinted at fractures in the Yakuza's dominion, vulnerabilities where individuals slipped through the cracks, exploiting the syndicate's reach without submitting to its control. This rogue existence was a challenge not only to law enforcement but to the syndicate itself, threatening the rigid order maintained by fear and loyalty. The city, with its maze of alleys and towering facades, became a stage for this tension between control and chaos. In this urban theater, identity was both a weapon and a prize, a shifting construct manipulated by those who understood its power. The masks blurred the lines between friend and foe, between reality and illusion, complicating every step of the chase. As the detective delved deeper into the artisan's network, the investigation began to reveal not just the technical means of the robber's disguises, but the psychological architecture underpinning his crimes. The artisan's masks were designed to unsettle, to introduce doubt and hesitation into the minds of pursuers, turning every encounter into a test of perception and nerve. The interplay between the craftsman and the thief was a silent collaboration, a fusion of skill and instinct that confounded the city's order. But questions remained. Who was the thief beneath the masks? What drove a man to sever ties with the clans that dominated the underworld, choosing instead to navigate the margins alone? And how far would the Yakuza tolerate this anomaly before the fragile balance fractured? The answers lurked in the shifting shadows, where illusion met reality, waiting to be uncovered. The mosaic of faces pinned against the cold metal board in the precinct's dimly lit war room was a stark testament to how elusive the figure had become. Each image, grainy and distorted by low-resolution cameras, depicted a man who could be anyone yet was no one in particular. 11 distinct identities, scattered across age groups, ethnic backgrounds, and physical builds, each captured in fleeting moments. Walking down crowded streets, slipping through subway turnstiles, or disappearing into alleys. The paradox was maddening. 11 men, but all seemed to bear the same intent, the same silent urgency that marked the thief's path. It was as if the criminal had fragmented himself into pieces, a living enigma wearing the faces of the city's anonymous bystanders. The nickname that emerged from the swirling rumors and media frenzy, the Ghost of Osaka, was fitting yet misleading. Ghost suggested intangibility, a presence felt but unseen, a shadow that eluded capture. But the truth behind the moniker was less poetic and more disquieting. The authorities weren't just chasing a vanished figure. They were hunting a chameleon, a man who manipulated perception and exploited the city's chaos to slip through every grasp. The name spread rapidly, plastered across headlines and whispered in hushed conversations, transforming the pursuit into a spectacle that captivated an entire nation. Despite the mounting public attention, not a single clue about the motive or the endgame had surfaced. The police had no clear profile, no discernible pattern beyond the undeniable skill and audacity of the thief. Their investigation devolved into a complex puzzle, a labyrinth of conflicting testimonies and uncertain leads. The media painted the ghost as a master thief, a criminal mastermind, yet the reality was far more elusive. What was the true objective behind these heists? Was it purely material gain, or something more intricate, hidden beneath layers of misdirection and calculated risk? The city itself seemed to absorb the tension, its neon-lit streets becoming a stage for a silent duel between hunter and hunted. Ordinary citizens found themselves cast as unwitting witnesses to a drama unfolding in back alleys and subway platforms. Surveillance cameras multiplied, and the police presence intensified, but with every tightened perimeter, the ghost's footprints only grew fainter. The labyrinthine urban landscape, with its endless corridors and shadowed corners, became both a refuge and a weapon. Within the investigative teams, frustration simmered beneath the surface. Detectives who thrived on patterns and behavioral analysis found themselves baffled by the ghost's ability to defy categorization. Psychological profiles proved unreliable when the suspect seemed to embody contradictions. Discipline masked by chaos, familiarity cloaked in anonymity. Each face on the board represented a dead end, a fragment of a puzzle that refused to coalesce into a coherent picture. The inability to pin down the ghost's identity gnawed at their resolve, turning the investigation into an exercise in futility. Amid this growing uncertainty, the media's portrayal began to shape public perception in unpredictable ways. The ghost was alternately demonized and romanticized, a figure both feared and admired. The narrative spun by journalists and commentators blurred the lines between fact and fiction, complicating the investigation further by fostering myths that tangled with reality. In this charged atmosphere, the city itself seemed to fracture along invisible fault lines, between skepticism and belief, fear and fascination. As the days stretched on, the authorities intensified their efforts to decode the ghost's movements, employing forensic experts, behavioral analysts, and even consulting with specialists outside the usual channels. The investigation took on an almost forensic quality, examining every detail from the angle of a security camera to the subtle shifts in the suspect's gait. Yet each new lead opened more questions than it answered. The ghost was not merely a criminal. He was a puzzle embedded within the urban fabric, a riddle that tested the limits of surveillance, memory, and perception. The tension between visibility and invisibility became the defining characteristic of the pursuit. The ghost was at once everywhere and nowhere, a constant presence that vanished as soon as it was glimpsed. This paradox created a psychological pressure on the investigators, who grappled with the feeling of chasing a specter whose motives remained inscrutable. The city's undercurrent of unease deepened, as if the streets themselves held their breath, waiting for the next move in a game whose rules were known only to one player. In this tangled web of sightings, rumors, and half-truths, the investigation edged toward a crucial juncture. Patterns began to emerge, not in the faces, but in the spaces between them. The ghost's identity might not be found in who he was, but in where and when he chose to appear. The urban terrain, with all its intersections and blind spots, held the key to unlocking the mystery. The chase was no longer just a matter of recognizing a face. It was about deciphering the language of the city itself, reading the hidden codes etched into its streets. The breakthrough came not from a new witness or a fresh surveillance camera angle, but from a meticulous review of old footage that had long been dismissed as inconclusive. Among the countless frames capturing fleeting shadows and obscured figures, one analyst noticed something subtle, almost imperceptible. It wasn't the tilt of a head or the way the suspect adjusted his coat. It was a tiny, involuntary twitch near his wrist, a barely noticeable flick of the fingers that repeated across every appearance. This microgesture was so minute that it had escaped detection for years, buried beneath layers of distraction and the overwhelming focus on more obvious identifiers. This twitch wasn't random. It was a habitual motion, embedded deep in the suspect's muscle memory, something that no amount of disguise or calculated behavior could suppress. The analyst, working late into the night, cross-referenced these microgestures with behavioral psychology profiles and found a pattern consistent with a specific kind of neuromuscular tic, often linked to stress or an underlying neurological condition. The revelation shifted the investigative approach entirely. Instead of searching for static physical traits, the team began to analyze the suspect's involuntary movements, treating them as a unique signature that transcended disguises and misdirection. The city itself seemed to respond to this new angle of inquiry. Mapping the instances where the twitch appeared alongside the suspect's known movements revealed a network of locations connected by more than chance. These weren't random stops. They were places where the suspect felt safe enough for his guard to drop just a fraction. The spaces between the sightings, alleys, back entrances, even the brief interior of a subway car, became critical nodes in this unfolding urban puzzle. Each microgesture acted as a breadcrumb, guiding the investigation through the labyrinth of the city's underbelly. What complicated matters further was how the suspect adapted to this growing scrutiny. There were moments when the twitch seemed to vanish, only to reemerge with renewed intensity later on. It was as if the suspect was aware, on some level, of the vulnerability this involuntary motion represented, and yet unable to control it. This tension between conscious control and unconscious habit introduced a psychological dimension to the manhunt, blurring the lines between hunter and hunted. The team's forensic specialists began collaborating with neurologists to better understand the implications. Microgestures like the one observed could be influenced by a range of factors: fatigue, medication, emotional stress. Tracing the timeline of the suspect's appearances alongside these variables became a new investigative frontier. It revealed not just where and when he moved through the city, but offered glimpses into his mental and physical state at those moments, weaving a more complex portrait than any photograph or witness testimony had ever provided. In the midst of this, the urban environment remained a silent accomplice and adversary. The suspect exploited the city's chaotic rhythm, using its noise and movement to mask his presence. But ironically, it was the city's very complexity that began to unravel him. Surveillance grids that once seemed patchy and ineffective now formed a mesh capable of capturing subtle shifts in behavior. The interplay of shadows and light, the cadence of footsteps, the barely audible scrape of fabric against concrete, all became data points in the expanding web of clues. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that this microgesture was more than a mere quirk. It was a fissure in the suspect's carefully constructed facade. The failure to conceal this involuntary act suggested a limit to the control he exerted over his own narrative. It raised questions about his psychological state, whether the pressure of evasion was eroding his composure, or if there was something else beneath the surface that had yet to be uncovered. The discovery ignited a new phase of surveillance and analysis. Cameras were repositioned to capture not just faces, but hands and wrists, the subtle articulations of muscle and bone. Analysts combed through hours of footage, frame by frame, searching for that telltale sign that could finally anchor the spectral figure to a real identity. Each confirmed microgesture was a thread pulling the investigation closer to a tangible breakthrough. Yet, even as the evidence accumulated, the suspect's true identity remained elusive. The gesture was a clue, but not a key. It offered a direction but no destination. The city's labyrinthine streets continued to swallow him whole, a phantom blending seamlessly into the urban sprawl. The investigation now balanced on this slender thread, waiting to see whether this tiny imperfection would be enough to unravel the enigma or simply add another layer to the mystery. The tension grew palpable as the investigators realized they were chasing more than a man. They were unraveling a pattern of behavior woven into the very fabric of the city's nightscape. The microgesture was a crack in the armor, an opening into the suspect's world, but to move forward, they would have to delve deeper into the psychological landscape that shaped such a compulsive signal. Understanding why this subtle motion escaped concealment might reveal as much about the ghost as the physical traces he left behind. The investigation had reached a turning point the moment the facial recognition algorithms flagged the anomaly. It was the first time the suspect had returned to a previously used identity, a decision that seemed reckless but was clearly deliberate. The location he targeted was more secure than any he had previously approached, protected by layers of biometric verification and constant surveillance. To gain access, he had no choice but to recycle a face, the one associated with earlier, smaller incidents that had never been linked together until now. This single misstep shattered the illusion of multiple perpetrators. The police were no longer chasing shadows scattered across the city, but a solitary figure whose methods, while varied, carried the same underlying signature. The data confirmed it. The same individual threading through the fabric of several crimes, each connected by that repeated visage. The algorithms, cold and mechanical, filled the gaps left by human oversight, drawing a map of the suspect's movements that stretched across months and districts. Behind the scenes, the profiles built by the forensic psychologists began to align. The suspect's pattern was less about randomness and more about calculated chaos. Each identity he assumed was a mask forged not just for evasion but for manipulation. The repetition of the face wasn't a slip but a necessity born from the constraints of the place he was about to infiltrate. The security protocols there didn't just scan for faces, they cross-checked behavioral cues, voice patterns, and even gait. Using an old identity was a gamble informed by an understanding of those systems, a gamble that ultimately cost him. Surveillance footage from the target site revealed a man composed yet tense, navigating the corridors with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the building's layout. Yet, subtle inconsistencies betrayed his duplicity. His reactions to unexpected encounters were measured but brief, too swift to be natural, suggesting rehearsed responses rather than spontaneous behavior. The psychological profile emerging from these observations described someone operating under immense pressure, aware that every movement was a thread in a web that could unravel at any moment. The city itself responded to the revelation with a shift in atmosphere. Streets that once felt scattered with unrelated crimes now pulsed with the knowledge of a single architect behind them all. The tension was no longer diffused across multiple unknowns but focused sharply on one figure. A ghost whose footprints, though carefully erased, had left enough trace for the net to start closing. Investigators pored over the digital breadcrumbs left behind, the encrypted messages, the discarded phone numbers, the abandoned vehicles. Each fragment told a story of preparation and retreat, of anticipation and adaptation. The suspect was not merely reacting to the environment. He was manipulating it, exploiting the blind spots in the urban surveillance infrastructure. His understanding of technology was deep, but it was his grasp of human psychology that offered the greatest advantage. He anticipated the responses of those trying to catch him, playing a game of chess against an unseen opponent. Yet, the repetition of the face, the very act that revealed his hand, suggested a limit to his control. It hinted at constraints, whether logistical, temporal, or psychological, that forced him into a compromise. This breach in his pattern became the focal point for the team tasked with unraveling his movements. They began reconstructing timelines, piecing together how and why he had returned to a known identity, and what that meant for his next move. Behind the closed doors of the command center, the mood was a mixture of cautious optimism and the weight of anticipation. The suspect was no longer an abstraction but a tangible entity, someone who could be studied, predicted, and ultimately confronted. The challenge lay in interpreting not just the data but the intent behind it, decoding the mind that had orchestrated a series of events designed to confound detection until this critical miscalculation. What followed was a shift in strategy. Surveillance expanded beyond static cameras and automated alerts, incorporating behavioral analysis teams and psychological specialists who could read patterns in movement and interaction that machines alone failed to capture. The city became a chessboard where every intersection, every alley, held potential clues, not just in pixels or fingerprints, but in the rhythms of daily life disrupted by this singular presence. As the investigation deepened, the line between pursuer and pursued blurred. Understanding the suspect's psychology was no longer a matter of profiling but a necessity to anticipate the next calculated move. The repeated face was a beacon in the darkness, illuminating the complex interplay of identity, deception, and survival that defined the pursuit. This new clarity brought with it an urgency to decipher the implications of the suspect's choice, to reuse a known identity despite the risks, and how that played into the broader narrative of his actions. The investigation was no longer about isolated incidents but about the architecture of a mind that had woven them together with intent and precision, setting the stage for what might come next. And so, when the police finally closed in, the hideout was eerily empty. Masks lay scattered across the table, each one a fragment of a life he had worn, but no real trace of the man behind them. The enigma remained, a ghost who slipped through every grasp, leaving behind only questions. What was real and what was performance? If a man can live many lives, which face truly belongs to him? It's this puzzle that lingers, one that challenges how we think about identity, truth, and the stories we tell ourselves. The case itself never found closure, but maybe the absence of answers is where the story gains its weight. Because sometimes, the greatest mysteries aren't solved. They're lived, haunting the edges of what we think we know. If you've been with me until now, thanks for sticking around and diving deep into this labyrinth. If this kind of unraveling, peeling back layers to find the unexpected speaks to you, you might want to hit that subscribe button. There's plenty more where this came from. And hey, if the story resonated or made you pause for a moment, drop a comment below with "that message was for me." It's always interesting to see who's really here till the end. Also, if something clicked during this video, a simple thumbs up is a nice way to acknowledge the journey we've shared. It's a small connection, but one I appreciate every time. Before you go, there's a video right here next to it that builds on this very theme. Take a look and keep exploring with me over there. No rush, just whenever you're ready to keep peeling back the layers.